Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, Defining Concepts in Current Media. I am your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. These books are available free for viewing at www.philosophypublishing.com. Along with me are our political analysts, Remy Canario from Washington, D.C., and Rick Samuelson, from a venture capitalist on the West Coast. Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
The purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media. And this week the topic is going to be about the recent acts of terrorism, or really bombings, and I'd like to discuss them and whether they are incidents of terror and how the media treated them. And first of all, I think we need to go into the nature of Islam itself, whether and why it instigates acts of terror. And it's because if you take a fundamental reading of the Quran, there are 3 types of passages that occur that are relevant to terrorism. And the first one is that it is directly requested of the follower to fight in the name of Allah. Second, the second type of passage is one that is that tells that the Quran tells fighting is necessary and prescribed for the follower. And thirdly, there are passages that indicate that there is a preferential system in paradise, whereby those who fight are rewarded to a greater degree than those who do not fight. So let's take a look at a couple of these passages that indicate this. First of all, the Quran does indicate that terror is prescribed and is used. And I'd like to go here to Quran, Surah 61, verse 10 through 12. O you who believe, shall I guide you to a commerce that will save you from a painful torment, that you believe in Allah and His Messenger, Muhammad, and that you strive hard and fight in the cause of Allah with your wealth and your lives. That will be better for you, if you but know. If you do so, He will forgive you your sins and admit you into gardens under which rivers flow, and pleasant dwelling in gardens of Eden for eternity. That is indeed the great success. Also from the Quran in Surah 2, verse 216, he specifically states Muhammad states that fighting is prescribed for you, and ye dislike it. But it is possible that ye dislike a thing which is good for you, and that ye love a thing which is bad for you. But Allah knoweth, and ye know not. Also from the Quran in Surah 3, verse 151, he specifically talks about terror. Quote, soon shall we cast terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, for that they joined companions with Allah, for which He had sent no authority. Also from the Hadith tradition, which is oral statements by Muhammad, and in the Bukhari collection, chapter 52, verse 220, Muhammad said, I have been made victorious with terror. So terror is mentioned in the Quran and prescribed for its followers. Now the second part is that I want to discuss is incentive. Why should the followers of Allah go out and risk their lives and fight or blow themselves up and create terror? So what is the incentive for this? Right from the Quran, Surah 4, verse 74, let those fight in the way of Allah who sell the life of this world for the other. Whoso fighteth in the way of Allah, be he slain or be he victorious, on him we shall bestow a vast reward. So nice incentive there. And also from Quran Surah 4, verse 95, not equal are those believers who sit at home and receive no hurt, and those who strive and fight in the cause of Allah with their goods and their persons. Allah hath granted a grade higher to those who strive and fight with their goods and persons than to those who sit at home. Unto all in faith hath Allah promised good. But those who strive and fight hath he distinguished above those who sit at home by a special reward. Okay, so we've got some incentive here to fight, as opposed to just kind of sitting around and sitting at home and kind of a support in the background. There is a risk-reward ratio going on here, and when I say risk-reward, it's almost really a sacrifice-reward that governs the incentive factor in the behavior of all life. Behavioral decisions are governed by incentive. That is, when you decide to do something, an incentive is present. Life expects that a benefit will accrue to it in its actions. So I'm going to take a little example here. When a student of Islam studies the Quran, he asks himself, what action will most benefit me? Well, when he weighs the priorities in his mind, what he really does is he understands the sacrifice that is involved with getting the resources in order to be able to get the rewards of what the Quran teaches. The equation is that the sacrifice equals the reward, and the sacrifice of the student consists of the time and effort and knowledge within an atmosphere of risk to obtain that reward. He must weigh the ratio of the sacrifice to the reward possibilities that he will receive after he executes his sacrifice. The smaller the sacrifice relative to the size of the reward, the more the incentive improves. So now he sees that from the Quran, in a normal sacrifice, doing a normal life of following the Quran, develop a commercial life for himself and raising a family, he gets a good reward by going to paradise, to heaven. So he concludes that he will follow the Quran and he will make the sacrifice to get his reward of going to heaven, as the incentive is there. But the Quran also teaches that if he is a soldier of the Quran and fights for Allah, he will have a greater reward in paradise. With a little bit of effort in this life, this will result in a more extensive and greater reward in the afterlife. This increases the incentive factor of the equation. Short-term risk producing an eternal great reward. And so the incentive ratio is very, very high to follow the Quranic verses. And thus our student friend may well end up fighting for Allah and becoming a jihadi. So now with the recent bombing attacks, we see that the media does not rush to call it terror. They also are quick to find some other reason, other than Islam, for which the bombing and the terror occurs. Or really I should say bombings, because there were several of them. The Democratic left and its major media allies suggest that economic and social disparities and social injustice cause these individuals to strike out against society. Well, let's examine this a little bit using our risk-reward ratio and an incentive factor here. Our indigent student and follower of the Quran now has before him a new equation. Let's see, the sacrifice. Well, that's violence to bring attention to his misfortune. If he's worried about social injustice and economic, social disparities, etc. So again, the sacrifice is violence to bring attention to this misfortune, this social injustice. Possible rewards, there's two of them. Self-satisfaction and maybe some attention, like from the media. Or, secondly, he gets caught, goes to jail, or even dies while being caught. So the risk-reward ratio here indicates that the incentive is not much if we choose this explanation. Thus, in looking at the two equations, I would take the equation of the Quran in being able to understand and describe what is causing terror. So if you get enough fundamental readers of these passages in the Quran, you're going to produce a certain percentage of the total adherents to the Quran going off and joining armies or creating terrorism while in connection with the armies, or joining ISIL, or what have you. So guys, what do you think? What about these bombings that we've seen over the last week or so? Remy, what do you think?
From a very similar perspective, the question of incentive. I would be quick to point out that Islam is hardly the only religion that teaches within its central text calls to violence or calls to action, struggling for one's religion and for one's God. I mean, let's take the case of Hinduism and its most famous text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is largely viewed through the lens of peace and finding fulfillment. Well, really what it actually is a conversation between Arjuna, the protagonist, and Krishna, an incarnation of the god Vishnu, where Krishna essentially convinces Arjuna to wage war against his brothers and bring about the destruction of his own race. So it is an act of self-submission in the service of God's will that brings about literally the end of his own people. If you were going to take that literally, if we're going to take the idea that calls to violence within religious texts must lead to actual religious violence in the modern era, then why don't we see more Hindu terrorism? And I think that the answer to that question has a lot to do with the answer to the question of why are the Swiss good at making watches? And there's no particular reason. It's just that they have a history of being good at making watches. There's a history of jihadi violence in Islam that has manifested itself particularly in the past half century. And therefore, if we're going to combat this tendency towards violence that we're seeing within the Muslim community, we have to look at this through the lens of the social sciences tools that we have available to us that explain these phenomena. I have a hard time believing that we're not doing enough on the security, law enforcement, and intelligence front, that there are still low-hanging fruit after a decade and a half of efforts since 9/11. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe I'm an idealistic, government-loving liberal, like everyone wants to make me seem like it. But if you're talking about incentive, a government of the United States has a tremendous incentive to protect its citizens. If we're going to accept my assumption, then what is left to be done is to reduce the incentives that lead someone to commit these acts. And I agree with you that a sense of religious fulfillment probably plays into that, and there is probably more that we can do to tap into the religious community here and abroad of moderate Islamic preachers in order to help combat the message of extremism. But I don't think that for any of these people, the religious aspect of it is enough to lead to actual acts of violence. I do think that a level of disaffection is an important part of the equation. Also, a desire for direction and personal fulfillment. And as you said, also of notoriety and fame. Now, if we can find ways to combat the perception that committing an act of terrorism leads to notoriety, leads to fame, leads to recognition, and that's what's left for us to do. And I'm not sure that government is the right way to do that. I mean, I think that if these people see themselves as receiving the honors of a martyr, then perhaps we do look in the Saul Alinsky kind of direction, and we systematize a process where we fundamentally ridicule the people who do this in a well-funded media outreach kind of way. I mean, I think that the government may not be the appropriate forum for this because they have to abide by certain codes of decency. You put the right comedic writers in charge of making fun of Muslims and make sure that half the country knows about this. I mean, let's see if that doesn't change the equation a little bit. And these are the kinds of strategies that I think that we're going to need to start thinking about. Maybe not that one in particular. Maybe it takes it too far. But just trying to hit this nail on the head hasn't been working, so let's approach it from a different side.
Okay. Rick, any thoughts?
Here's a prediction, for what it's worth. The continuing insistence by the liberal left that the value of diversity should be always put ahead of issues surrounding public safety will continue to cause liberal leaders to be removed from office across Europe and ultimately within the United States. A government that does not put public safety ahead of any kind of value surrounding immigration, refugee assistance, and otherwise diversity-related issues is not a sustainable government. And you're going to continue to see a pattern of the current leaders in Europe, starting with Europe, because the problem is obviously much more severe there on account of the fact that they have vastly greater numbers of Islamic immigrants. You're going to continue to see a whole generation of leaders, including Angela Merkel, the heads of state in Italy, France, Netherlands, and elsewhere, all removed and replaced by far more conservative, public safety-minded leaders. And they will systematically begin deporting a number of Muslims and also essentially shut the boundaries to Europe as these attacks continue. I don't know that that's going to happen soon in the United States because actually the number of attacks is relatively small as a percentage of our population. But as they continue to grow, and if the United States continues to accept hundreds of thousands of Syrian, Afghan immigrants who will inevitably have terrorists or would-be terrorists or people who ultimately become terrorists amongst them, public sentiment will change, and the liberal leaders like Clinton that we're accustomed to will be removed from office.
Okay.
So Richard, I do have a question for you. By account of the religion of peace, there have been just about 650 people in Western nations killed by terrorist incidents in the past year. Should we change our immigration system so that any kind of risk factor that would lead to just over 600 deaths per year should no longer be allowed? I mean, maybe people who have traveled to parts of Central Africa that are prone to creating viruses such as Ebola. We don't know what's going on over there with the zooviruses. It's a very dangerous situation. We've seen what happens with Zika. Should that be a factor, considering that it could presumably lead to a far greater negative impact? We start thinking of immigration solely in terms of public health and dealing with such small numbers. The implications are chilling.
Look, I'm just making a prediction. And in my mind, all right, because of my philosophical bent, I think public safety comes ahead of any diversity issue or any refugee status issue, always and everywhere.
But why that one case? If we're just going to think about immigration and refugees in terms of their safety implications, taking a much proactive view of bringing people into this country from foreign countries and making sure that that creates absolutely no risk to the general population. I mean, it isn't a double standard to think of this in terms of someone's religion and not in terms of their health.
Excuse me, the guy, the Somali who just stabbed 9 people in Minnesota, was an immigrant. The Afghan who just attempted to blow up hundreds of people in New York was an Afghan immigrant. Do you think that's lost on the general public? Do you think they don't understand that?
Do you think that we should stop immigration from the Dominican Republic and even Puerto Rico, which is part of the United States, because of the threat of Zika?
Well, look, I think there are health-related screening tests you can do to deal with a problem like that. That's a different situation. With the Afghan, Syrian, and other immigrants, it's obvious the United States and Europe have no means of screening these people. And the sorry story of the fact that this Afghan immigrant was reported to the FBI by his father, and then the whole thing was dropped. I mean, it's just a case in point. It's pointless. It will not work. It has not worked, and people are dying as a result of it.
So you do agree with the statement that we should stop all immigration from places infected with Zika unless every person who comes into the country is screened? Yes or no?
I think you're onto an entirely different topic. We're talking about terror here.
You're talking about terrorism as a threat to public health and a reason to compromise our long-standing values on immigration. Now, fine, if we want to make immigration completely inured from any kind of threat to the population, then let's have that conversation. But to do so in the context of Islam, in a context where Islamophobia is rampant, at least deserves that we examine the underpinnings of the...
Islamophobia, it may be rampant, it is also justified. When they come over here as immigrants and start killing our people, Islamophobia is justified. And I think it should be justified. All right?
Okay.
There's a prejudice against these people if they continue to do this. And they have shown a consistent pattern of continuing it. And in fact, I think the left liberals in Europe and the United States don't care about Americans, American citizens. If a few of them get blown up and their arms and legs blown off, who cares? It's a small price to pay for diversity. That is a very, very particular, very, very ignorant, and very, very hateful way of looking at your fellow citizen. Shame on you.
Hateful.
It is. And not just against the Islamic people, against your own citizens who you're saying have no consideration for the value of their lives of their fellow citizens. Well, as soon as you start dehumanizing people to that level, you're the same risks, then you're the problem.
No, you are the problem, right? Have you ever expressed any concern about the people in Boston that were blown up by those idiot immigrants from Texas?
Where were you on 9/11? Because I know where I was, Manhattan. I remember what the air smelled like. I live with a greater threat of terrorist violence than you ever have. So please do not patronize me.
Then how do you stop it?
Through smart policies. And the ones that that Richard is embracing will not lead us to success. They are self-defeating. They reinforce the cycle of violence. I don't believe in diversity because in a vacuum because it's some random ideal that I've decided to embrace at the cost of everything else. I believe that it honestly makes me safer.
I started this discussion with a prediction. And the reason I started with a prediction is because people are commonsensical individuals, whether they're in Europe or in the United States. They know that if this Afghan immigrant had not been allowed to enter the country and become a U.S. citizen, people would not be injured today in New York and New Jersey. They know if the Somali guy who's running around stabbing people in a Minnesota mall was not allowed to come to the United States, those people would not be stabbed. They're not stupid. They know that. And that is why people like Clinton people like Angela Merkel will be removed from office.
Well, it's an interesting prediction. Once again, I would point out that I believe I have shown the shortcomings of the logic, and we'll see how things pan out.
Okay, guys, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank everybody for participating. And obviously, this subject is to be continued. We'll talk about it in the future here on the Philosophical Angle program. Guys, thanks very much.
Thank you.